Let's imagine the 10th dimension. And in doing so, we will find ourselves compatible with the current thinking of modern quantum mechanics, quantum science. Whether string theory is ultimately proven to be right or wrong really has no bearing on the journey that you and I are about to take. The point of this exercise will be that by imagining all 10 dimensions, we will have imagined a fabric that can account for all aspects of reality. So hit that subscribe button, buckle up, Buttercup, and let's begin. Most of us are quite familiar with the first 4 dimensions. We have grown comfortable with the idea that we live in a 3-dimensional world, and that time can be thought of as an additional dimension. We will use the relationships between those first 4 dimensions to gradually build a mental image of what each succeeding dimension could be like. By taking our imagination through one level at a time, we will arrive at a construct much larger than what we could ever hope to imagine all at once, building one layer upon another until we get to the 10th dimension. We start with a point. A point in geometry has no size, no dimension. It is purely a descriptor which indicates a certain value or location in a system. In other words, a point is just a pointer. The first dimension for our purposes is any straight line passing through 2 points. We start with a point, as mentioned. Like the point we know from geometry. It has no size, no dimension. It is just an imaginary idea that indicates a position in a system. We will now create a second point. Then, the second point can be used to indicate a different position, but it too is of indeterminate size. To create the first dimension, all we need is a line joining any 2 points. A first dimensional object has length only, no width or depth. Whoa, I tried to go already to the, let me make that coordinate. Whoa, Jesus Christ. Anyway, all right, so there's our 2 points. Here's a line. So we have first dimension right there, folks. Tell you what, some pretty professional pedagogy right there. The second dimension, moving right along, folks, is the first dimension. If the first dimension is length, then the second could be called width. But for this discussion, let's come up with a slightly different way of describing the second dimension. Let's begin by drawing a straight line. At some point along the line, we'll draw another line that branches off from the first. We should now have drawn a shape that looks something like a simple letter Y. But what we have also drawn is a representation of a 2-dimensional object. The first line we drew has only length, or rather it represents only length. For of course, if we were to look at that line with a microscope, we would see that it has not only length, but a good deal of width as well. So that line is intended to represent a 1-dimensional object. As soon as we had split that straight line into 2, or branched off to a different line, we entered a representation of the second dimension. The object we've drawn now has length and width. If we now take our first dimensional line and draw a second line crossing the first, we've entered the second dimension. Welcome to the second dimension, ladies and gentlemen. The object we are representing now has length and width, but no depth. To help us imagining the higher dimensions, we're going to represent our second dimension object as being created using a second line which branches off from the first. Now let's imagine a race of two-dimensional creatures called Flatlanders. What would it be like to be a Flatlander living in their two-dimensional world? A two-dimensional creature would have only length and width, as if they were the royalty on an impossibly flat playing card. Picture this: a Flatlander couldn't possibly have a digestive tract because the pipe from their mouth to their bottom would divide them into pieces, into two pieces. All right. All right, so that was getting a little bit far beyond my drawing skills. So wanted to, with you, my dear esteemed viewer, I was trying to show off and act like I knew something about dimensions. But here we go, folks. This kind of puts things. There's our Flatlander. Okay, that's the Flatlander royalty right there. Picture this: a Flatlander couldn't possibly have a digestive tract because the pipe from their mouth to their bottom would divide them into two pieces. And there we have that, divided into two pieces. Illustration 2, imagining the 10th dimension, moving right along, folks. We're building up to the 10th dimension. I want you to hit that subscribe button. Okay, there we got some Flatlander trying to view our three-dimensional world would only be able to perceive shapes in two-dimensional cross-sections. A balloon, for instance, would start as a tiny dot, become a hollow circle, which inexplicably grows to a certain size and shrinks back to a dot before popping out of existence. There you go, folks, right there. Okay. And we three-dimensional human beings would seem very strange indeed to a Flatlander. There's a Flatlander checking out a human being. Looks like he has some kind of Flatlander X-ray vision. So the third dimension, a fold. A famous book written in 1884 by Edwin Abbott, Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions, described a world of Flatlanders, two-dimensional creatures living in a two-dimensional world, written under the pseudonym A Square. Can't make this stuff up, folks. Written under the pseudonym, the book describes the adventures of a square in Lineland, the first dimension, and Spaceland, the third dimension. While the book is an attempt to popularize the notion of multidimensional geometry, it is also commonly described as a clever satire on the social, moral, and religious values of the day. What would a three-dimensional creature such as ourselves look like to a two-dimensional Flatlander? Since they can only perceive two of our three dimensions, they would be able to see us only in cross-sections. A Flatlander viewing one of us, passing through their flatland world, might first see 10 small objects representing our toes, which would become two larger objects, which would grow and shrink and grow again as the Flatlander's viewpoint traveled past our feet and up our legs, becoming one large object as they reached our middle, and so on. To a Flatlander, we 3D beings would be able to pop in and out of their two-dimensional world as if by magic, and our texture and form would be quite inexplicable. In the same way, we humans would find the 2D information that a Flatlander sees to be a useless and confusing jumble of lines all in the same place. Now picture this: an ant marching from the left to the right side of a newspaper page could be thought of as a Flatlander walking along in a two-dimensional world. What if we want to help that ant get to his destination sooner? You should watch my video on Stargates. So we fold the newspaper to make it meet in the middle. Now, see, that is exactly what a Stargate does. It folds space and time in a wormhole. It opens up a wormhole. So think of this newspaper as a Stargate that's creating a wormhole, folding space and time. So we've created a Stargate for the ant and thus opened a wormhole for the ant so he can finish his cross paper trek much more quickly and go on his way. When we folded the paper, we took the representation of a two-dimensional object and moved it through the third dimension. If there had been Flatlanders living on that page, the ant would seem to have suddenly disappeared from one location and magically reappeared at another. So for our purposes, let's call the third dimension what we move through to get from one point to another in the dimension below. Since we are all three-dimensional creatures, let's not waste time talking about all the other aspects of what it means to be three-dimensional. By using this mental shortcut, imagining dimension 3 as what we move through to jump from one point in dimension 2 to another, we have a tool which will be useful in imagining the higher dimensions. So here's our tool, okay? The third dimension of fold, imagining. Does look very. Let me make this. All right. So imagining the third dimension is the easiest for us because every moment of our lives, that is what we are in. A three-dimensional object has length, width, and height. So that's our reality based on our five senses. But there's another way to describe the third dimension. If we imagine an ant walking across a newspaper which is lying on a table, we can pretend that ant is a Flatlander walking along on a flat two-dimensional newspaper world. If that paper is now folded in the middle, we create a way for our Flatlander ant to magically disappear from one position in his two-dimensional world and be instantly transported to another. We can imagine that we did this by taking a two-dimensional object, folding it through the dimension above, which is our third dimension. Once again, it will be more convenient for us as we imagine in the higher dimensions if we can think of the third dimension in this way. The third dimension is what you fold through to jump from one point to another in the dimension below. So you see, there's the fold of the newspaper. And that is essentially what a Stargate does with a wormhole opening and folding space and time. All right, so we're going to hold up there. We covered the first three dimensions. We talked about some Stargates, technology, and how basically using these models and imagining ants as Flatlanders and hitting that subscribe button, we all basically get to where we're going much faster from point A to point B and the new Earth Golden Age timeline. It's as simple as that. Namaste, namaskaram.